Think about the people who have left the deepest impression on you in your life. Not the people who talked the most, not the ones who commanded every conversation or made sure their voice was heard above everyone else's. Not the loudest, the most dominant, the ones who made every moment about themselves. Think about the people who actually stayed with you, the ones you still think about, the ones whose words come back to you weeks later, sometimes years later, in quiet moments when you least expect it. The ones who made you feel something in a conversation that you couldn't fully explain. Now ask yourself, were those people loud? Almost certainly not. Almost certainly, the people who have made the deepest impression on your life were something much quieter, much more precise, much more intentional than loud. They said less than most people in the room. But what they said landed differently. They didn't try to fill every silence. But when they spoke, something in you went still and listened. And here is what I want you to understand at the very start of this video. Memorability has almost nothing to do with volume. It never did. The myth that you need to dominate a room to be remembered, to be the most talkative, the most performative, the most constantly present, is one of the most damaging lies ever told to quiet people. Because it makes you feel invisible when you're actually sitting on the very qualities that, used with intention, would make you the most unforgettable person there. Let me show you what I mean. In the 1990s, Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman made a discovery that changed how we understand human memory. He called it the peak end rule. And what it says, essentially, is this. People do not remember experiences as a whole. They don't recall the average of everything that happened. They remember two moments. The peak, the single most emotionally intense moment of the experience, and the end, how it felt when it was over. Everything in between, largely forgotten. The middle of the conversation, the small talk, the pleasantries, the filler, none of it gets stored with any real weight. What gets stored is the moment that hit the hardest, emotionally, intellectually, or psychologically, and the final impression you left behind. This is why someone can spend an hour at a party talking to 6 different people and walk away remembering one specific exchange above all others, not because that exchange was the longest, but because something in it was different. Something in it created a peak. A moment that rose above the noise of everything else and lodged itself somewhere real in the other person's memory. Your job is not to talk the most. Your job is to create that moment, and then to end well. Now here's the psychological principle that explains why certain people stand out in a room full of people without saying a single extra word. It's called the von Restorff Effect, named after the German psychiatrist Hedwig von Restorff, who discovered in the 1930s that when presented with a list of similar items, the human brain will almost always remember the one that's different, not the biggest or the most, just the one that broke the pattern. In social situations, most people are doing the same things, making small talk, discussing what they do for work, laughing at safe jokes, navigating the surface of every conversation without ever going below it. That is the pattern. And your brain, which has been brilliantly designed by millions of years of evolution to notice what's different, will remember the person who broke it, not by being louder, but by being different in a quieter, more specific, more intentional way. So what does that actually look like? It starts with the conversation itself. Most people skim. They ask the standard questions, accept the standard answers, and move to the next person. But the person who becomes memorable does something that almost no one else in that room does. They go deep with one person rather than wide with many. One real conversation beats 10 surface-level exchanges every single time, because depth is rare, and rarity is memorable. When you ask a question that nobody else thought to ask, when you follow a thread that everyone else would have dropped, when you sit with someone's answer long enough to respond to what they actually said rather than what you expected them to say, that person feels something. And feelings are what memory is made of. Here's a specific technique. In your next social situation, instead of asking the questions everyone else is asking, try asking one question that makes the other person actually stop and think. Something like, what's the most surprising thing you've learned about yourself in the last year? Or, if you could go back and do one thing differently, what would it be? Or even something simpler but unexpected, what's something you're genuinely excited about right now? These questions do something remarkable. They interrupt the script. They shift the conversation from performance to something real, and they signal to the other person, I am not asking out of politeness. I actually want to know. And people remember the person who made them actually think, who made them go somewhere in themselves they hadn't gone that day. There's another thing that makes people unforgettable, and it's one of the rarest traits in any social setting. It's the willingness to say something true that nobody else is saying, not controversial for the sake of controversy. Not provocative for the sake of attention, but honest in a world where most conversation is carefully managed to offend no one and reveal nothing. When someone says, quietly and calmly, the thing that everyone in the room was thinking, but nobody was saying, something shifts. People lean in. They remember. Because honesty, real honesty, is so unusual in polished social settings that when it appears, it stands out like a single color in a black and white photograph. You don't have to be controversial to do this, you just have to be willing to have a real opinion. To say what you actually think rather than what seems safest to say. To offer a perspective rather than a reflection of whatever the other person said back at them. People who have no opinions are, almost universally, forgettable, not because they're bad people, but because there's nothing to hold on to. Nothing that creates friction or electricity or a reason to keep thinking about the conversation after it ends. Have a point of view, state it with calm confidence, and then genuinely listen to what comes back. That exchange, that real back and forth between two people who are both being honest, is the rarest and most memorable thing that can happen in a social setting. Now here's the one that most people never think about, and it might be the most important piece of the peak end rule in practice. How you end the conversation. Most people end conversations by trailing off. The energy fades, someone checks their phone, you both sort of drift away with a vague, "Yeah, well, let me know." And that's it, forgettable by design, because the ending is flat, and a flat ending erases a lot of what came before it. The memorable person ends intentionally. They end while the energy is still good, not after it started to drain. They say something specific as they leave. Not a generic, "Great to meet you," but something that refers back to the conversation you actually just had. Something like, "I'm going to think about what you said about that for a while," or "I really hope that thing you're working on goes the way you want it to," or even just, "That was a genuinely good conversation. Thank you." Specific, personal, warm, and brief. Then you leave. You don't linger until the interaction loses its shape. You leave at the peak, or just after it. And the last thing the other person feels, which the peak end rule tells us is the thing they'll most remember, is that the conversation with you was worth having. That feeling follows them home, and it attaches to you. So here is how all of this comes together in practice. You don't need to work the room. You don't need to be everywhere and meet everyone. You need to find one or two people and go deep. Ask the question nobody else asked. Say the thing nobody else said. Listen in a way that makes them feel genuinely heard. And then end the conversation with something specific and real before it has a chance to fade. That's it. That's the whole strategy. One meaningful conversation creates more lasting impression than 20 forgettable ones. Depth leaves a mark that volume never can. And the person who goes home having genuinely connected with two people, rather than having superficially performed for 20, is always the one the room remembers. This is low-key mind. Because the quietest people in the room, when they understand what actually makes someone unforgettable, become the ones nobody can stop thinking about. Subscribe if this is how you want to move through the world. Share it with someone who has always felt invisible in rooms where they deserve to be seen. And drop a comment below. Tell me the most memorable person you've ever met and what it was they actually did. I'll see you in the next one.